Right, so before I recorded this live blog, I decided I've got too many ideas going on at the moment. So I thought, bugger it, I'll let you decide. And you decided adaptations. So let's get into it. What most people think of when they think of the term adaptations, which is probably what you're coming into this immediately, is screen adaptation. Hollywood's current fascination with taking existing properties and transferring them onto the screen. Let's go a little bit into the backstory of film and adaptations before we go into the more broader topic. Those that don't know, when film started becoming a thing, initial movies were essentially theatre productions with a camera set up just to record the actual theatre performance. Cinema language itself didn't really catch on until someone went, well, we've got to take all these short segments of film to splice them all together to make a longer sequence of film. Why don't we start moving the camera in and just, having a close-up of the one person talking as opposed to the whole theatre? In fact, that's where most media theory comes from, is still from the theatre. The fourth wall, for example, the camera as the audience, pretty much all dates back to that. So naturally, theatre plays were the first adaptations. Tell again? A lot of original properties were based on novels because that was the primary media at the time. It was, as simple as going, well, we've got the source material, we just need to put the book onto the screen. And that's where you get adaptations. Now, where it gets really kind of interesting is how Hollywood especially has taken the idea of adaptation and how it's evolved. Freudian? How it's evolved over the last few decades. It used to be more of a thing that they'd take a book, put it onto screen, and they just copied the text essentially. Then cinematic language developed its own style. You may have heard the theories like show, don't tell. That's very much almost the antithesis of novels. Novels always have to tell you what's going on, but because a picture is worth 1,000 words, you can convey a lot of information in a compressed amount of time. So the language of cinema allows you to essentially condense a lot of books. That's when things start to get interesting. It used to be very much the idea that a property would get bought really only for the rights to the name, the characters and stuff like that. Plenty of adaptations throughout the decades really didn't care too much about the text as long as they had the rights. It was essentially a marketing tool. Authors don't particularly care sometimes because they just get more sales in the books. Studios don't care, they just get the rights before anyone else. Some examples of movies that don't really reflect the original novels is classics like Planet of the Apes. They just wanted to get the rights to that name and that property so no one else could do it. Even to the point when Tim Burton announced he was doing his remake of Planet of the Apes, he was like, oh, we're going to stick more to the original novel and make the apes more futuristic and kind of benevolent, make it more peaceful. But essentially it ended up just being his kind of carbon copy of the original movie without any of the nuance, or it was just copy pasted on, and it was not good. Another movie you'll probably never think of as adapted for a book, but it's a brilliant movie, is The Running Man. Well, I say brilliant, it's 80s schlock action, which is a lot of fun. That really has no resemblance to the original novel by Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King. So it's essentially they just wanted the title of the book and the name of the main character and the name of the main villain. That's pretty much it. The villain is still a game show host, but realistically speaking, the entire thing is completely different. And of course, reading the book afterwards, you kind of go, what the hell's going on here? The book is interesting of itself, but the movie's better. Now, cut to about, let's say, 20 years ago. And this young up-and-coming filmmaker called Peter Jackson had got the rights to Lord of the Rings, this really beloved series of books. And he really was hell-bent on making it like almost a one-to-one adaptation of these books to the screen. And that was probably what really kicked off the modern-day equivalent of the source-accurate adaptations. Because really before then, it really wasn't that big of a deal. And of course now, since then, you got Harry Potter, for better or worse, you got Twilight, 50 Shades, you've also got a lot of YA adaptations, which are really, really sticklers to the source. We're only just dealing now with books to movies. What about the other genres? Well, for the most part, book to movie is probably the easiest one. You can literally copy paste the novel into a script document, change or get rid of all the fluff text, and just keep the dialogue. You can pretty much make a movie that way. Adaptation still requires a little bit of effort, even in those regards, because again, filmic language is different to book language. There's a tradition in novel writing where authors get paid by the page, which is why you end up with some of these most ridiculously long novels that really go nowhere, have a lot of padding. You can't do that in a movie. If you've got 90 minutes to tell a story and your book is 3 hours long, you're gonna have to pare it down. That's why, people rag on Peter Jackson for cutting out these characters like, was it Bomber Bill or whatever his fucking name is, I don't care. An entire subplot that was not necessary. And in the movie, you don't. He's gone, you don't notice it. And only the fans get really upset. But you're dealing with an adaptation. You have to cut some of the fluff out. The one that I don't particularly like, but I have to admit it works, is the... So one of my favorite characters in the Harry Potter books, which was a very much a background character, which was Apes, played by Rick Mayall. They did shoot some footage for the first movie, but again, it's one of those things that had to be cut for time. So what they did, they cut him out, and he's not in the first movie, so they kind of just stopped having him in the rest of the movies, even though he does kind of play a bit of a kind of major part in book 5 when the Weasley twins, basically go on their rampage. They couldn't just add him in there, it would make no sense. So he's essentially cut out from the entirety of the franchise, which is fair enough. If he didn't add anything to the story, you cut him out. This happens all the time in cinema, especially when a movie is getting really long. That's why you have a lot of footage on the cutting room floor. Like if I actually showed you this entire vlog in its entirety, you get really bored because I'm cutting out the pauses, I'm cutting out the tangents, or at least the non-relevant tangents, stuff like that. As long as the movie flows well, that's fine. Now we get to the interesting ones. Because as I said, book to film, relatively easy. What happens when you get to a medium that's already visual? You see, when people read books, their minds are kind of filling in those blanks. So a lot of people do tend to go, this isn't the movie I imagined, but at the same time, you can kind of let it pass. So what happens when you've already seen all those visual cues and all those things that you're burned into your mind? And this is where we get problems with comic book and video game adaptation, especially video game adaptation. Let's deal with comic books first, because this is pretty much my genre. I mean, I collect comic book movies. I love comic book movies, even the bad ones. I've got a lot of comic books. In fact, what's inspired this conversation, I saw online a lot of people talking about Into the Spider-Verse, because the movie is based on the comic books Spider-Verse, the idea of Spidey meeting different versions of himself to fight a bigger bad. That's pretty much where the similarities end. The Spider-Verse movie is about Miles Morales and his origin story and him becoming a hero. He meets other versions of Spider-Man, teach him how to be a hero. All that kind of usual storytelling stuff. It's one of the best superhero movies. It's definitely one of the best Spider-Man movies ever made. It really has nothing relating to the comic book. They took the idea of the comic book and used that to tell another story. Again, back to that kind of old style of Hollywood adaptation. But of course, this leads to people going, well, I would have loved to have seen this scene, or I'd love to have seen this scene. I love this panel, why isn't it on here? I've kind of have those issues, not with Spider-Man, but with another comic book. We'll get to that in a tick. The movie doesn't particularly bother about trying to get the specifics of that original text, but they want to get the idea. And they meld it into the idea of Miles Morales' origin story. And it works brilliantly. It's an adaptation, but it's not accurate adaptation. And it works. Proving that you don't need to be 100% accurate to the source material to get a good adaptation. Now, would this work for, say, The Hobbit, Actually might have been better for The Hobbit. But would this work better for, say, Harry Potter? Probably not. So you've got to really choose your battles. You can take an obscure text and you have a better chance of changing that text to really suit it, especially if the original text wasn't very good, or at least it didn't work well with the right audience. And there's plenty of adaptations that have done that. In fact, I think, as a rule, if you're going to remake something, remake a bad or a failed movie. I will talk about this in more length when I eventually do a remake versus reboot versus the original kind of thing. Don't hold me to that. So you have something that's beloved, you really want to stick to something that's relatively similar to that. But if you have something that's a bit obscure, you can have fun with that. You can change that around. Adaptations have varying degrees of quality. Some adaptations are great, some adaptations are bad. Comic book adaptations have a bit better chance of being great than some other forms, because you've essentially got your pre-written storyboards. Realistically speaking, the idea of taking Spider-Man and all those poses and everything like that is a visually stunning thing, and you can make that into a great movie. You know, Sam Raimi made some great films in that. Homecoming was brilliant. Into the Spider-Verse is fantastic. The Amazing Spider-Man, not so much. So what you want with a comic book adaptation is you don't want to be following too much of the actual story, or at least the original source material, because, again, comics have their own language, which is vastly different to cinema. There's a theory in comic books where things happen between the panels. So, of course, when it comes to movies, you can't just not show the things between the panels. I'm probably getting too ahead of myself. But if you can take those moments and transform them, and as I said in the other one, comics are a bit of pulp fiction, no pun intended. They are kind of mass-produced trash. As I said before, mass-produced trash can still have a good story, can still talk about social issues, all that type of stuff. So what you want to do with a comic book adaptation is you want to take the themes. You can't really use so much of the writing, because the writing is very different to the comic book as it is to a movie, as it is to a novel. So you want to take the themes, the storylines, and adapt them to movie language. And that's where things start to fall apart for comic book adaptations a lot of times. Now we get on to possibly the worst contenders of adaptations. Video games. Oh boy. It's genuinely hard to try and figure out, has there been a really good video game adaptation? Mortal Kombat's good-ish. Street Fighter's kind of terrible, but enjoyable. Okay. The biggest problem with adapting video games to any other medium is essentially you're taking a player choice narrative and locking that away. Just from the get-go. Let's not even go into actual story plot problems with video games. Video games in their nature are player-driven. A player can always fail a video game. Actually kind of makes it more unique than any other medium. Your actions can actually lead to a bad conclusion. Guess the novel equivalent of this is Choose Your Own Adventure. But even then, that's because you're given a binary choice often where your instincts and knowledge cannot lead you to the right path immediately. You're given two questions and one of them's probably going to lead you to be horribly killed just because. Games are different from that. You know the results of your actions before you make them, essentially. You know if you push the button too early, you're gonna jump a bit too early and you'll fall off the cliff and die. You also know if you push the button too late, you'll run off a cliff and die. You also can immediately go back to that point and try again. When you take a video game and you try and adapt it to another medium, particularly movies, you're usually going to have to rely on the plot. Traditionally, video game plots are kind of bad. Okay, let's go back to our previous example, Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat just has a plot contrivance to get two people to beat each other up. Let's face it, that's about it. There's no big narrative. They've injected narrative onto it, but there's no big narrative in Mortal Kombat. That guy's the bad guy. You go into there, you beat each other up. Now, In Mortal Kombat, there's actually multiple endings depending on who wins the combat. So you do have a technical beginning, middle, and end, if you talk about all the fights being the middle part. So how do you translate it into a movie? Well, first off, you go, well, we need to decide on who the protagonist is. In this case, they went, we're going to go with Liu Kang because he's probably the hero. It's amazing, for an American film, they actually didn't go with Johnny Cage, but now Liu Kang makes more sense from the narrative point of view. But then you go, well, okay, so we have this story, so Liu Kang has to win. But we have all these other protagonists because we want to get all this cast of characters and then we want to bring them all in. So we give him Johnny Cage and Sonya Blade as his sidekicks. So of course you've got to inject that narrative into there, and that kind of starts to fill out the world. Then of course you've got to add in your villains, and you don't need to expand upon the villains so much, they're just going to be more flavor dressing, but you need to start talking about Shang Zhao. So you have to add Zhang Zhao's narratives in plot lines into there, and as you can see, it's starting to build up. But realistically speaking, it still comes from this idea of A person beats up B person. Now, I think Mortal Kombat is a relatively well-constructed film. It's still realistically a 90s action film at heart, so you can give a lot of that a pass. But it's not nuanced in any significant way. And then you get to something like Street Fighter, where they essentially make the American the hero and cast him with a Belgian, and you get Raul Julia as Bison, who looks nothing like him, to the point where they had to give him these really fake muscle pads because he was dying with cancer. But he makes the movie. And it's just a bad film. It goes nowhere. The plot is completely absurd. It just has nothing. I can't even remember. I've seen it. I can't even remember what happens in that movie because it's just a lot of things happening with no actual plot thread. That's because even the Street Fighter 2's storyline is lesser. However, of course, the animes and the mangas in Japan actually really fleshed out those stories. And if you read them, you see, wow, these are really good. But they don't star the Yank. So yeah, that was really bad. Same era, you got the Super Mario Brothers movie, which, for what they were dealing with, it's not a good film. It's a fun film. It's got nothing to do with Mario Bros, but for what they had to work with, there's no way they could have made that. If they tried to make Mario now, you'd be like, what drugs were they on? And the answer is LSD. So video games in and of themselves can be an absolute nightmare to try and adapt. And we're still seeing that nightmare continue. We just recently had the Assassin's Creed movie, where even fans of Assassin's Creed who are willing to buy a video game every year because Ubisoft wants to siphon out their pockets every year. Even they don't like this movie that makes no sense. Although I heard the best way to watch Assassin's Creed is to listen to it with the soundtrack to Moana going on in the background. Apparently it works. Adaptations are hard when it comes to these cross mediums because you're dealing with a lot of these issues, especially the language. I have to always emphasize this. The language is one of the key problems. How a game flows is radically different to how a movie flows. Imagine trying to take 50 hours of narrative from a video game, trying to pick out those key moments in a game where you go, man, I love that, and compress that down to 90 minutes. You're gonna lose a lot of shit. And you also, sometimes you lose a lot of the feel of a game. And we're getting better with some plot-driven games, but we still can't get there just right because we're still also really forcing ourselves against this problem of changing the narratives to work. And you have to wonder, why do we even bother? Certainly one reason, greed. I kind of would love a Mass Effect movie, but there's no way they're gonna be able to take that 50 hours of gameplay just from that one film and make a really solid movie out of it. It's just not going to happen. A Mass Effect TV series could be a thing. Because hell, that works for Game of Thrones. I mean, the fact that we call it Game of Thrones instead of the original title of the series. Because Game of Thrones as a novel wouldn't work as a movie. But you take that chunk of text and pass it all out into an episodic series, that can work. They still have to change a lot of things around just because of how narrative flow works in a TV series as opposed to a movie. In fact, we've had TV series get turned into movies and they kind of suck. I mean, maybe a few that are really good, but really on the whole, most of them are just terrible. You also, that's again, you're taking something that's say a 20-minute narrative and trying to expand it out to 90 minutes. It most of the time doesn't work. I'll give you a really good example. Doctor Who was made into 2 movies back in the late 60s, early 70s, both starring Peter Cushing as the titular Doctor Who, but for some reason they decided to make the Doctor human and his companions were his grandchildren. They're not very good. They're really not very good. They're essentially remakes of the Dalek episodes, like the first Dalek episodes and the Dalek Invasion episodes, and then just don't work. An episodic thing can work because you've got a beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end, or beginning, middle, end, which is a to be continued. So essentially you've got these stop, start, stop, start, stop, starts, and that doesn't really work when you're trying to compress all these episodes into a movie, because then you essentially got movies stopping, starting, stopping, starting, stopping, starting, as opposed to a narrative flow. So yeah, even TV, a language you would rationally associate with cinema, often doesn't work. The only good transition from TV to movie that I can think of off the top of my head is Firefly to Serenity. Oh, I'm going to start dunking. I don't mean to dunk. Firefly was an interesting but potentially flawed show. I said it. I liked it, didn't love it. Couldn't really get through it. Got about halfway through it and I'm like, oh, I'll watch this again later, and it's been 10 years. Sorry. But Serenity, I think, is better than Firefly. I'm going to get some hate for this. Serenity was a contained story. It was essentially the plot ideas from season 2 of Firefly. And you can kind of see that where they introduced this character, Mr. Universe, who we're told is important, is given key important things, but ultimately has nothing to do with the movie. If that was a character we would have gone to know and love throughout the series, the end would have been a bit more poignant. This is what I mean about adaptation decays. Anyway, Firefly being a series of adventures with an overarching narrative, you can kind of do away with those series of adventures and just focus on the overarching narrative when it comes to a movie. And I think that actually is what helped Serenity. You've got this main plot, the discovery of what happened on this colony and practically the origins of the Reavers and how it ties into the evil government. So that is a really good basis for a movie. Not sure it would have been a good basis for an entire season, because it would just been coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. I think that's why Moffat's overuse of narrative arcs as kind of like a primary source of the adventure kind of falls flat. Or at least he tries to make it a primary source of the adventures, but keep them in the background. But they're always there, in the background. Oh boy. The magic box syndrome. I'd rather rewatch Serenity more than I'd ever rewatch Firefly. I think I would have loved if Serenity had actually made enough money so they could have made a series of Serenity movies. So I reckon the titling of all that extra crap, especially that Whedon-esque kind of fluff he loves to do sometimes, and tying that into a really good narrative would have actually worked. I think Serenity is way better than Firefly. And I'm going to get crap for that. Oh boy, I'm going to get downvoted again, aren't I? Oops. Anyway, I've gone off topic. I think I've gone off really topic. Let's reel this back in. So all up, there's a reason why adaptations fail and there's a reason why adaptations work. The balance is figuring out what's going to work for each property. You can always take a great story in one format and completely ruin it for another format. And if you notice, a lot of those times is because they either do away with what made the project great in favor of trying to just tell the story. Like, this gets really bad with kind of some science fiction adaptations, because science fiction traditionally has a lot of commentary embedded within it. So when you take out that commentary, you can lose a lot of it because people are too fascinated with, I want blasty spaceships and pew pews. Let's go back to books. If I want to get another bunch of fans to hate me, this is why the Star Wars novels were a bit crap. Now, not all of them. The Timothy Zahn stuff was brilliant. A lot of Kevin J. Anderson stuff, brilliant. A lot of the early extended universe stuff, brilliant. Then it started to veer off. Basically what happened was, really there was no real oversight. Lucas essentially said, as long as you're not doing the stuff I'm doing, I don't particularly care. So there's a story where Luke is trying to find his mother in, I think it's in the Darksaber trilogy. Basically what happens is Lucas hadn't wrote it or was in the process of writing it, and they weren't allowed to use it. So narratively speaking, in the expanded universe, Luke never finds out about Padme Amidala. And then you also got the problem is that as those books continued on, that narrative starts to diverge and change. You've got so many authors, so many authors lend their voices to things, and some books are brilliant, some are utterly garbage. Black Feet comes to mind, the Corellian trilogy kind of comes to mind. The New Jedi Order was a steaming pile of crap that deserves to be shot out of an exhaust port. But because people have grown up with this idea of this universe for the last 20 years, those books started coming out in the mid-90s, remember? A lot of people don't want these new Star Wars movies because they want these characters. And some of these characters are brilliant, let me get wrong. I still think they would have gotten so much fan appreciation if they'd have just called Ben Solo Jason. Jacen. Because Jason Solo in the books does go to the dark side, just like Ben has. So it's just one of those things. And again, from a narrative point of view, Ben makes no sense. Han had no real relationship to Ben. Leia never met him. And let's not forget, the expanded universe has come into the original movies. In the original source book material for Coruscant, it was just called the Imperial Planet. And when Lucas was writing the prequels, he hadn't come up with a name for the Imperial Planet, because it wasn't called the Imperial Planet, obviously, because the Empire didn't exist. And someone turned around and said, just use Coruscant. We've got the rights to it. The fans will love it. Just call it Coruscant. And he did. And the Star Wars discussions for another time, but some of those books were brilliant and some of them weren't. So I read some of those books and I could hear like John Williams' score coming into my head. Some of those books I'm like, going, this is just trash. Oh, I know one person's going to hate this. I'm sorry, Brenton. But that's kind of the point, is that even going backwards and trying to make a movie into a book. Oh, novelizations are a completely different thing. Just go and check out the Book Was Better podcasts on fruitlesspursuits.com. I may have appeared there twice, talking about Mortal Kombat of all things. I love adaptations as a concept. You can get some really good stories coming out of them. The problem is you really need to be careful. You need to take what made something good. It's not about the words sometimes. It's not even about the characters occasionally. Take what made people love the things. The TLDR is that if you're trying to adapt something, find what makes the thing good and try and work with that first. Don't just try and adapt a video game because it's a video game. What worked in a video game that you think would make a visually interesting story? What's the point in remaking Donkey Kong, the original game? It's essentially King Kong. But what about the ideas in that could work? Most adaptations fail because they just don't really care. They look at it as a marketing opportunity. And I think that's why the superhero genre has been full of really crap movies for so long. They're more interested in the promotion and the marketing than they are in the story. And for the most part, the story and the characters is why people love superheroes. We love the Thing as the blue-eyed, cuddle monster. Ben Grimm, with a name like Ben Grimm, and the outward persona of this big rocky mountain of just destruction, is probably one of the most kind-hearted characters in the Marvel Universe. He knows what it is to be perceived as a monster. So why don't you focus on that as opposed to turning him into an actual killer? The counterpoint to the Thing is Johnny, the pretty boy jackass. And that's why I love the 2000s Fantastic Four movie. The stuff I loved in that movie is the play between Johnny and Ben. The story's kind of crap, but that's because it's really hard to adapt to a Fantastic Four movie. It's always interesting to look at the differences in the languages between the medias, because that's how we're going to start to see them start to correlate a lot better. If we can figure out how to make a good video game movie, we can open up a branch of cinema. There's so many good stories in games. It's just that it's hard to try and bridge that gap. And you're not going to appease everyone. That's the other point. You're not going to appease everyone. Can you imagine a Bioshock movie? Because most of the players just went, I'm going to complete this. I'm going to basically murder every girl. I'm going to collect all the items and be the super big mega boss. And then when they get the terrible ending and they go, yeah, I finished it. And then someone turns around and said, you know, you get a better ending if you don't harvest all the little girls and you actually save them. And then they start complaining that it didn't get the good ending. Kind of hard to make into a movie. Like, share and subscribe, all that type of stuff. Let me know how this goes. I've had like 2 cups of coffee, but I haven't had any water. I'm starting to feel really dehydrated. Dehydrated. Is that where you're so thirsty for water you stop a freaking terrorist organization? Oh, I'm gonna have to cut that, aren't I?